Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery and I've got a couple tubs that need tending to. They're the finishing tub that I've got up here on the top shelf, and over there on the side is the other one that we're going to work on. It was a week ago when we last checked in on these, and if you're a regular on my channel you might remember that I had sort of spent an inordinate amount of time on this one right here, dealing with the challenge of trying to separate baby tiny worms from overly damp castings. And in the end I think I did manage a couple hundred worms as the result of many hours of fiddling around with it. And then later in the day around 11 o'clock I just felt like I really wanted to complete what I had set out to do earlier in the day, and I had set out to tend to both bins. So I had prepared a second video in which I got back down here and took care of that bin over there. So my hope is that we can take care of both of them today. Maybe not set the bar so high and try to accomplish so much today. I'm going to sort of pull back a little bit and focus more on continuing the migration of the worms out of the material in these bins by maybe only adding food, not extracting worms. And the main reason is that up until now I've been using the newest of my bins, which rests here on the ground on the left. I've been putting all the worms that I've been collecting, all of my systems, into that one tub, and I've been trying my best to keep track, but I think I'm somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 worms already. So I'm holding off on migrating any worms until I've got my newest bin set up, which is still empty down there on the right on the floor. It's really down there as a reminder to myself to build that thing up so at some point in the near future we do have a place to put more migrated worms. So let's get to work on this. I think we'll start with the oldest of the two, my finishing tub. So let's get it up on the bench. So the paper covering the finishing tub is one of the few remaining covers that I've got on my bins. And it might just stay off at this point if we're finding that it's impeding the evaporation of the material. So the one thing I'm not too fond of is when the material on the top surface dries, it gets kind of hard and clumpy. But I think if we start around and we drop it down under the surface where the rest of the material is a lot more damp, it'll soften up and become more crumbly as a result. Looks like we've also got a couple little volunteer plants popping out here, little seeds starting off, which I will always nip off and get rid of. So the feeding zone that we dealt with a week ago is over here. And one of the things that I often do is I refer to it not just as a feeding zone, but it's a feeding zone with a purpose, so I treat it as my horizontal migration feeding zone, which is attempting to migrate the worms horizontally out of the material into a single place where they can be rounded up. So here I'm not extracting worms, but I'm definitely curious to see how we're doing in terms of rounding up worms. So we'll take a peek in there first. Let's just go ahead and uncover the feeding zone. And I don't want to litter the finished compost with all kinds of bits of leaves and whatnot. So I think I'm going to bring back our piece of paper here. It'll kind of serve as a drop cloth so that we can partially unload what's in here to get a better look. Then we can just put it right back where it was afterwards. The plastic that was covering it up was intended to help moisture recirculate. So even though this stuff looks kind of dry, I can tell from touching it and just from trying to crumble it and listen that it's really not that dry. It does have moisture content to it, but maybe not as much as the worms would favor. So we're probably not going to find a great number of worms in this material. Probably got to go a little bit deeper to get to the point where worm action might be happening. I'm wondering if I can just slightly pull some of this finished casting material back. Gives a better view of what's happening down here. I guess we could stir this up a little bit just to get a better sense of how things are progressing. So we've got some leftovers here from the previous feeding attempt. And let's not forget that the feeding that was put in here was intended for itsy bitsy tiny worms. So it's not like we've got a whole bunch of monster worms coming over here to gobble it all up. It's not surprising that we're finding a little bit of leftovers in here. So when I kind of slow down and I allow a moment or two for the worms to actually get mobile and start moving, I could see them better. I do see a fair number of really tiny ones. Right down here we've also got a somewhat juvenile worm, one that doesn't look like it's quite at the age where it could reproduce. I don't see the that bulge on its body that it needs so that it can reproduce. What else do we have in here? This looks like it might be a chunk of watermelon. I see red and green. This, I guess, is where you might expect to see a bunch of worms hanging out, but I don't see a great number of them. So we're definitely attracting worms, because there are worms in the material, but definitely not a lot of them. And there's still a little bit of food left in here as well. So hopefully it's continuing to serve the purpose as a lure to attract worms over. But I could certainly see the need for adding a little bit more to this just to keep that happening. But I think that the only reason why we would want to lure worms, or try to lure worms, was that if we felt like we had worms in the finished castings that still needed to be lured out of the material. Like I said, last week when I was doing this, I did feel like I was seeing lots and lots of cocoons in the material. So why don't we remove this from here temporarily and see if we can get a better handle on what's happening here. Looks like we've got a little visitor here in the bin. I think this is maybe a millipede. Millipedes and centipedes have names that are very similar to each other. Centipedes, the 100-legged bugs, are the ones that attack your worms. The millipedes are just helpers in the bin, and I believe that that's what we've got here. Centipedes are really fast movers, predatory insects. These millipedes are a little bit slower, and they don't do any harm, so I don't bother with them. They're welcome to stay and help out if they want. It's the centipedes that I tend to try to eradicate if I can. So now we're going to go ahead and give this material a little bit of an inspection to see how things are progressing from not only the perspective of worms depopulating it, but also from the perspective of how it's drying out and how manageable it might be if we decided it was time to try harvesting it. A lot of times a person might use a screen to try to harvest their material, and if the material is really clumpy, it just sticks in the screen and never goes through. It makes the harvesting of the material a real nightmare. So I'd like to try to get the material to the point where it's dry enough that it could easily pass through a sieve should I decide to screen it. Although a lot of times I'll just treat this as finished castings with or without larger chunks of little sticks and stuff. If there's things like that in there which a screen would catch, but I don't screen it, I don't worry too much about it being in there. But I am definitely noticing that there are far fewer worms in here than I expected. I'm not really sure why I expected to see a lot of worms, probably because I think that I had seen a fair number of cocoons last time we were in here. So maybe I should also be trying to see if I can spot cocoons that are still yet to hatch, which would put us into a slightly longer waiting pattern, you know, allowing time for them to hatch. But so far I haven't really seen any, I don't think. I haven't really been carefully looking for them either. And even though they're really tiny and the camera might not be capturing them, I'm definitely still seeing a fair number of little baby worms cruising around in the material. Here and there, you might find one sort of tucked away inside of a chunk of castings, probably dining on a little chunk of food that's still stuck in there. And I think that's another nice job that they're going to do as they emerge. They're going to knock out any remaining chunks of food that might still be in the material. And then at some point they might start to catch wind of the fact that there's even more tempting, delicious stuff over here that they should come over and check out. But at least when they emerge, there's still plenty of moisture for them in here. Probably still plenty of food for them as well. So I definitely like the way this material is coming along. It seems like it's approaching the finish line. It's a little bit sticky and clumpy, but probably not too far away from drying out to the ideal consistency. And the depopulation of the worms also seems to be progressing pretty nicely too. So I find a fair number of little baby worms in here. And in time they'll grow to a larger size. They'll have a larger appetite. They might want to make their way over into our feeding zone to get a more substantial meal. And as this stuff dries out, it'll also become less of a hospitable place for the worms to stay in. So the dryness will also become a reason for the worms to exit. So I think we're doing pretty good here. I didn't come down here prepared with any food, so I will have to run upstairs really quick so we can drop a couple items into this feeding zone, just so it can continue as is, continue luring the worms out of the material. And this stirring up of the material is also probably going to help a lot too in the drying process. So I just want to make sure I've, thoroughly agitated the material. All the stuff at the very bottom is what you're going to expect to be the most damp and in the most need of drying. I'm trying my best just to get that stuff up off the bottom and move the more dry stuff that's been on the surface for the past week down. Help it all equalize, help it all become a lot more harvesting friendly. So I think I anticipated this needing a little bit more time, especially since I was observing so many baby worms cruising around. But I don't really see too many cocoons. So hopefully we're at the point where all the cocoons that we're going to have baby worms coming from them have at this point hatched. Now it's really just a matter of giving the worms and the material a chance to get out, and a chance for the material to dry as well. So why don't I shoot upstairs really quick and grab a couple items from the refrigerator so we can drop them in here and we could reconstruct our feeding zone here and then let things get back to work. So what we have here is a mix of some broccoli, some strawberry. We'll give them a banana as well, plus one more handful of broccoli and strawberry. So now it does seem like a fair bit of food. Maybe it is a bit more than necessary. At some point when we extract the worms that have made their way over into it, the leftover food will just go with the worms so that they can have some partially broken down food to continue feasting on once they get relocated into their new home. So I'm just sprinkling a little bit of crushed eggshell over the food, since the worms that we're going to be feeding with this are presumed to be baby worms. And we could bring back all this stuff that was in here to cover things up. So we'll use this cardboard we have to cover things up at the end. And we could drop in all of this leafy matter on top, which is a really nice carbon source to help balance out the nitrogen-rich food that they've just been served. So I think I'll just pour it off now and use these cardboard bits to cover up with. If not for that piece of plastic that's covering things up here, this material would certainly be very dry. But it's nice to see that this cardboard and the leafy matter is nice and damp from having been covered with the plastic. So the plastic covering will go back to continue serving that same purpose of capturing any moisture that tries to evaporate out of that feeding zone and helping it to remain in the bin and continuing to make that feeding zone a nice damp place. But out here we're going to leave the coverings off at this point. Allow for nature to do its thing, allow for the moisture in this material to evaporate off. And then hopefully the next time we check in here, we'll have slightly drier material, slightly fewer worms, and potentially the option to simply move the worms that have come together and call this casting material as done. So it does feel to me like we're approaching the finish line on this, which is a terrific thing. All right, let's go get that other bin taken care of. Now here too, it's very likely that we're simply going to leave this paper covering off in the end. These were a couple of the last few containers where I was continuing to cover up with a piece of paper. But in the interest of allowing the material to air out and not get overly damp, I've been eliminating the coverings off of most of my bins, if not all of my bins. So chances are we're going to follow suit with that here too. So let's see how things are progressing in our attempt to migrate the worms out of the castings. Here we've got material that's pretty far along, I would say. The feeding zone looks really nice. A lot of fresh castings have been deposited onto the top. So we're going to kind of take a similar approach here. We're going to just peel back what we know to be our tub of finished castings so that we can get a better view of what's happening in the feeding zone. Here we're not seeing a pile of dry leaves and cardboard. Here we're seeing much more castings. And the reason is that we've probably got a lot more large worms hanging out here. So now we're actually getting down into some of the cardboard and leafy material that was added in here as bedding to complement the food that they were given. Obviously the size of the worms is kind of what we had expected, a larger group of worms in here as opposed to just baby worms, which is what we were expecting to see in that finishing tub. And luckily, even though we're in the feeding zone, which is where you would expect to see the most moisture, we're not seeing a lot of pooling liquid on the bottom. It's kind of a relief because I have been seeing that in some of my bins. But it does look to me like the majority of the food that they've received has, for the most part, been eaten. This to me looks like a chunk of leftover food, whatever it is, I can't really tell. But there's not much left of it. Let's see what else we can spot in here. I believe it was in this bin last week that we had told ourselves that waiting 8 days seemed like a long time and that we would want to definitely check in on this bin sooner than 8 days. So today being 7 days since the last time we were in here, seems like we're kind of cutting it close. But luckily we've still got an environment that looks like it should continue to attract worms because there are little bits and pieces of food in here. Here I think we've got some of the nasty lettuce that had been placed in here. Maybe it's just not as interesting to the worms as whatever else it is that they'd received. I believe it was maybe green beans was the other item that had been added in here, but I don't see any signs of that. Maybe that was the more favorable food item as opposed to the lettuce. However, I believe we do have a little tiny remnant of the green beans that were put in here, or string beans, or whatever they're called. It actually looks like this bean is trying to sprout. But I think I just put an end to that. I just cracked it in half. I want it to be worm food. I don't want it to develop into a plant. But that's a good sign. It's a good sign that they've made pretty good progress on the food that they'd been given, and that we've got a pretty good number of worms assembling over here in the feeding zone. But like I said, we're not going to be extracting these little guys today. Today we're simply going to be continuing to feed the feeding zone to try to continue spurring on the movement of the worms out of the finished castings over into this feeding zone. So why don't we just go ahead and return these old chunks of food that they'd been given a week ago, so they can continue breaking that down. And then we can go ahead and we could pile in a little bit of fresh food for them too. So I'm just going to stack up what's happening over here a little bit better. I thought that was a sprout. I thought there was another bean that had started sprouting, so I just wanted to check that really quick. Loosening things up here a little bit so we can add the fresh food in. So these guys are going to get something similar to what the other bin received, but here we could see much larger chunks of food. It's not really the ideal situation, right? Because surface area is important when it comes to feeding your worms. But sometimes you're really just limited to what you got, and this is what I have in my feeding assortment here. So they'll receive that. And an assortment of other stuff in here. Not sure what we've got going on. Maybe that's a piece of cucumber. I think that's a cucumber for sure. We got some strawberry, some cucumber shavings. Looks like a pretty good assortment of food. Maybe we'll throw a little bit more in there. How about if we just give them that banana and we'll consider that they're feeding. We haven't even really inspected the material. That's why I don't want to go too overboard. I'm still just basing this feeding on an assumption that we've got a lot more worm population to migrate. So why don't we really quickly give this an inspection as long as we're here. See how this material is coming along in terms of the worms moving out. I'm already observing one or two worms over here, pulling them up off the bottom. The material is definitely drying out nicely. And it wouldn't surprise me if we didn't really find a great number of worms in this. It does almost seem to me like we're on the verge of being able to consider this as a finished tub. It's even making me wonder if I had prematurely fed the feeding zone. Maybe it wasn't even necessary. I've got to get in the habit of better sequencing my activities, I think. If in fact we've got no more migration activity to facilitate, then why build up the feeding zone? But here and there I'm definitely spotting a worm or two. I'm assuming also that for every worm that I spot, there's a number of other ones that I'm not seeing. But this material is definitely getting there. That is for sure. And I like to see that. I'm going to try to scoop out some of this more damp stuff. I'm not trying to distance the worms from the feeding zone per se. I'm really more interested in just getting this more damp castings material up off the bottom so that it too has a chance to dry out a little bit. And hopefully the worms will simply recognize the material out here as being perhaps a little bit more dry than they would like, and then they'll gravitate over towards where the feedings are occurring. But I'm definitely interested in seeing this material dry out nicely, so at the cost of distancing some of the worms from the feeding zone, I'm trying to get this damp stuff out to a spot where it can more readily dry off and become easily handled when it comes time to harvest it. So I believe that we're now definitely in the home stretch. There's really not a whole lot left here to happen. This material, I believe, if we give it another week or so, especially if it's left uncovered, that it will dry off nicely, as a result becoming less and less hospitable for the worms to continue occupying, inspiring them to go searching for a more damp and comfortable place to be, and that'll be over in our feeding zone. So it is quite possible that in a week's time we'll be able to do an extraction of the worms and harvesting of this castings material and bring a close to this bin's life cycle. That's pretty cool. So let me just make sure I've given this entire tub a good agitation of the material, get the more dry stuff down in, get the more damp stuff out on top. And then we could let it get back to work. Shouldn't be much left now. So while I'm not overly concerned about leaving the casting material uncovered to dry, I definitely want to cover up the feeding zone, because all of this delicious food just open to the air is bound to attract flying insects and pests and whatnot, which is something we don't want to see happen. So for that reason, I'm making sure to stack some fresh leaves over the top here in order to cover up the newly added food and try to minimize the temptation and avoid having insects get drawn to it. Now the other thing we could do as we bring back our coverings is to not only restore this piece of coffee filter that was covering the feeding zone, but I can even add a couple more. Just to try to maximize the coverage here and limit the amount of temptation we allow to make its way into the air. So now here I'm going to try to make sure that we've got plastic covering up our feeding zone so as to recirculate any moisture that might try to evaporate from there. Make that into a nice damp cozy spot that the worms would be attracted to, while over here we're allowing for the moisture to evaporate, give the material a chance to dry off. And I think we're doing really good. Oh, that's interesting. Look at that logo. And look at the name of the Apple company. I wonder if they're going to have to change their names. Sorry, I find that whole situation just to be ludicrous. All right, everyone. That's really where we stand with our composting tubs here. One of them is making its way to the finish line pretty nicely, this one right here. And the other one that's in the process of finishing might need a little bit more time, but we're not in a great hurry for that to happen, so it'll happen when it happens. So I've got a little bit of cleanup to do around here, but I'm not going to take up your time with that. Before I go, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you so much for sticking around and keeping me company. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments section down below. And while you're down there, be sure to remember to give me a quick like. Hit that thumbs up button to show that you enjoyed the video. It really helps a lot, and I really appreciate it. And also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.